All right, good afternoon, everyone. That's what I call enthusiast reaction. It is the last session of the summit. Aww. But it's going to be the best session of the summit. Yeah. All right, it's a quick poll. Obviously, if you're in this room in some way, you probably work with some F5 appliances, I assume. So has anyone heard of the new module, Application Services version 3, AS3? Right, let the record show 2 people rose their hands. Okay. So, let's begin. Are you tired of working with the F5 configuration in the GUI? Is REST API just not cutting it out for you? Well, we have the answer for you. Introducing the F5 AS3. But wait, there's more. It's absolutely free. F5 appliance is not included. So, thank you. See? Look at that. So here's the agenda. I'm going to go over why I ended up presenting this topic, what the story was. We'll go over what the AS3 is, its components, some notes and tips, things I come across the way that will help you guys out. How we're going to push the demos, push the configuration into the F5, and we're going to see how it fits into a pipeline. And I might have to skip some of the demos I've set up that are just kind of pushing configs in. Probably want to spend more time on how I actually use it in a pipeline. And we'll sum it up, no demo, and we'll go from there. All right, here we go. So my story. This is my Twitter thingy, Jim Rock Arruda Twitter. And I'll have a lot of these session materials on GitHub. It's going to be a couple days to get everything organized and uploaded. I'll have the slides. I'll have some references for F5's documentation. And I'll have a lot of the examples that I'm using in the demo today. So, quick story about me. I'm from Rhode Island, so I talk with my hands a lot. And my company, we started doing a virtual pipeline to create environments. And one thing that we had missing was configuring the F5 as part of that pipeline. So get on a call, the vendor. Oh, I want to use looking at the REST API. There was a PowerShell module from the gallery. But there was a lot of work still to be done. There was some things left that didn't actually solve for. So the vendor then pointed me in the direction, this is literally a year ago. Oh, we have this new module called AS3, Application Services version 3. At the time, it was like version 3.1, 3.2. They now have version 3.10. And basically, he said you can declaratively configure your application-specific things in one JSON blob. I'm like, what? It's like, yeah. It's like, well, we'll see what this thing is about. And this is also a picture of me and my dog. Oh, yes, my dog's tongue actually sticks out like that all the time. And she wasn't too thrilled with me mocking her. I was making the decision, oh, should I use my wife or my dog in this picture? Sorry, honey. Phoebe's just cuter. Now, I got 4 to 6 weeks before she sees this, so I have some time to plan my escape. And one other thing is I used to be a physics high school teacher, so a quick physics lesson. Does anyone actually know that there's no such thing as gravity? The Earth just sucks. Okay. So what is the AS3? I know, dad jokes are coming. Here we go. So it's a JavaScript iControl LX plugin, a lot of jargon there, which exposes a declarative REST API on the appliance. So it's a little module you have to actually install on the appliance to make this available. It's used for creating application-based objects, so virtual servers, VIPs, pools, pool members, you can do certs, iRules, and a bunch of other things. There's a large list of things. If anyone has any questions, just please don't feel free to raise your hand. Wait to the end. No. Feel free to raise your hand. Ask me anytime. It abstracts away the minute details of the application objects. So you can actually simply just define, oh, I want a virtual server, a pool with these 2 members. Push it in. AS3 will take that, and all the other settings that go along with those objects, AS3 will fill in for you with default values. If you want to change any of those default values, you can then specifically name them in the declaration. It supports multi-tenancy. So what the AS3 actually does, it creates a partition on the F5. And the F5 has the concept of a partition. So most people probably have a lot of their configurations in the common partition, or the virtual pools and stuff like that. So the AS3 actually will now create a partition off of the common partition and create all these objects in there. And that kind of basically segregates the application from the common space. So you actually won't touch any of the legacy configurations. Anything net new you want to configure, you can go in this partition, and it's safe from actually touching anything on the appliance. And it's driven by JSON. Okay, moving on. So here are some components. And let me tap into, here we go. So the components of the declaration are a few simple things. We have the AS3 class. See here, everyone can see this okay? And in your JSON, it's just a few fields you define. So you define the AS3 class, and there's an action item here. And listed here is a few things you can you can define with action. Deploy basically commits the configuration. Dry run will be the first demo I'll do. It basically validates the configuration before passing it into the device. So if it's valid, it'll return true, and you know it's a good configuration. Otherwise, it'll just error and say, oh, no, not good. Redeploy, I don't really use this really at all the other ones. Redeploy, basically, you can redeploy an existing declaration again if you know which ID it was last, and it keeps like the last 15 items in a list somewhere. Then moving on to the ADC. So this is the application delivery controller. There's a few more items here. So ID, this is like, I actually use GUIDs to give the ADC an ID for the declaration. You label it, basically what you want to call it. So in this case, sample 1, or mark as like a description, and update mode selective, that is the default. And update mode selective, what that does, if you leave it as selective, when you push in your configuration, anything that was defined for that tenant only will be changed. Anything that's not, it leaves it alone. If you use the complete mode, anything not defined in that declaration, it will remove. So I usually stay with selective. And an example of all of the schema items is on this. This is right from their documentation. So this is a giant list of all the options you can actually configure. I've only scratched the surface on a few. And here are the rest of the items you have for ADC. And it is best practice when you specify the schema version, which is also the version of the AS3 you want to use, that you keep the declaration in sync with the AS3 version you use. It is backwards compatible, but you get the most out of the feature set of the schema by keeping the versions in sync. Any questions so far on that? Any other classes? Tenant class, that's what creates the partition. And there is an optional parameter for the default route domain. You have application class, which defines application. And the important note here, this template, you can choose HTTP, HTTPS for the type of service you want to configure. If you do that, it automatically names your virtual server, the first virtual server, service main. You can't change it when using one of these templates. If you use the generic template, you are allowed to change the virtual server name. And that's usually what I use. A lot of my configurations is generic. The shared option actually is, there is a shared application off the common partition. You can put items in that other tenants can access. The problem with that is if you have a bunch of configuration declarations, you have to define the shared thing in each one. If you leave it out in any of them, it will actually remove them all. Ask me how I learned that. So service class, this defines the virtual server, where you name out your pool, iRule, Cert, so on and so forth. The pool class, where you define your members, what monitors you want to use, things like that. So those are the components of the AS3. So far, so good? Following along? It's not too bad. All right. So some notes and tips. The AS3 becomes a source of truth. So once you start using the AS3 to configure any application objects. The objects that are created in the partition, if you go in the GUI and change any of those, and the AS3, and you don't put them in your declaration or manifest file, next time you push those in, whatever changes made in the GUI will be deleted. It's not in the declaration, they're removed. So if you decide to use the AS3, keep using AS3 to keep configuring your application objects. The AS3 cannot write to the common partition at all. It can't. So that safeguards you. Any legacy configurations you have, any application objects you already have there, won't be touched. Can't target them. But you can reference some objects that are in the common partition. I have some examples there as well. The account that you need to use, the account role that is needed is administrator role on the appliance. I've had called F5 a couple times, like, is there a way to like not be administrator role because our security and F5 guys are freaking out about this? And unfortunately, it is what it is right now. They'd have to completely write their firmware and rework their security roles to actually have that changed. Here's a big one. Disable expect 100 continue. I had no idea what that was until I had the problem. So when I was running the call to push the configuration in through remote utility server or from Octopus Deploy, for whatever reason, I'm using PowerShell this under the covers. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, please let me know, because I don't know why this does it. The expect 100 continue was being appended to the header going into the F5 from a remote call from PowerShell for whatever reason. Something that I think was based on how .NET is making the remote call.
I think it's fixed in core.
Okay, might be fixed in core. I'll have to try it in core. So this is actually the line of code that you need to put in the code that you're going to use to execute or push the configuration in that disables that feature. If that feature is enabled, F5 sees that in the header, it waits for further data. It sits there and waits and waits and waits. Eventually the session times out. You get some random error, which is 502 bad gateway. That's what you get back. And you have like, what is going on? It took about 2 or 3 weeks with F5 support to actually get through this. And now it's up on the documentation, so you're welcome. Funny note also, I've asked our vendor, how many other people are using PowerShell and some of the tools that I'm using to do this? And he's like, you're the only one that I know of. I'm like, oh, great, thank you. It requires a minimum version of 12.1. whatever on the big IP, so anything further and up will work fine. And it has a validation tool for VS Code, which is pretty neat. I'll show that off. So here's a little pipeline overview, basically how last demo. So I use ADO, Azure DevOps, for my repo, store my manifest files. And when I do a check-in of my code, a PR build runs. I have some pester tests that check the validity of my configuration. And I have a CI build that then packages my manifest and pushes it off to Octopus. And then Mr. Octopus in the middle there then does some variable magic that I use. I'll go over that in a little while. And deploys the config to the F5. And then the AS3 takes my JSON declaration and then configures the appliance. Demo time. You ready? All right, here we go. Should I do it? No, I'm not going to do it. I was going to sacrifice his phone to the demo gods, but I didn't do it. Okay. Ooh, go back to the demo. Okay, let's see. Everyone can see this pretty well? Yeah, it looks nice and big. So here is our sample configuration, what it looks like. Kick this off. All right. So the very top line there is our VS Code validator. And I have to actually, when I get back, I have to call up a vendor at F5 because they actually changed this URL whenever they update the AS3. So I'm using version 3.8 for this demonstration, as you can see up there. And what they did was they had updated it to 3.10. So my older link no longer worked. They broke the validator link, and I had to update it to make the validator work again. Well, that's the link that you just add that link as it's shown here in your configuration. Enables a validator. So you hover over one of the classes, one of the items in the class, and it gives you a description of what it is. And if I make a change to anything, some of them, it'll validate the value. So, oh, see a squiggly line? Oh, it doesn't work. Well, value is not accepted. You have to have one of these values instead. This is pretty cool. Before this existed, I did most of this in Pester, which I left in place anyway. And also check case sensitivity based on the value. So for class declaration, it has to be a capital ADC. F5 is case sensitive. I learned that the hard way a couple of times myself. So I'm going to persist this configuration, so it will write it to the drive of the device. It'll save it. And come on, Jim, keep clicking. Okay. So here's our class ADC class. Here's our tenant class, sample 01, application. Is our A1 class, application class. Service main will be our virtual server. That's what's going to be named. That's the address it's going to get. That's the pool it's going to reference as default, web_pool. And we define our pool with an HTTP monitor and that service address with service port 80. Now I'll flip over to the code side. Oh, before that, I'm going to verify that there are no configurations on my appliance right now. So you see no other partitions listed. There are no virtual servers. There are no nodes. There are no pools. I'll then click on iRules. Here are the default iRules that are there. We'll go back to that in a minute. So I'll go back to this. I'll pause here for a second. So this is basically how you push a configuration in. It's pretty simple. I'm just pulling in that basic sample JSON into a variable, pass it into my JSON, pass it in to create a JSON body. Now the URI, that is how you call the AS3. So that URL, so you have your load balancer address, and you add management shared app services declare. That is the endpoint that the AS3 is listening on. That's the URL you call. I pass that into a variable also with my creds, which I already loaded previously. And I pass it out to declare that results. There's another property called results. It outputs nice, real generic little message. All right. So I'm doing a dry run, which will only basically do a validation of that configuration, see if it actually works. And boom, there's our message. Dry run was true. Success for the host is called, my F5 appliance is called localhost, and the tenant was sample 01. Okay, so now we'll do this for real. I'll go over to the basic sample. Okay, there we go. And here is the configuration for that. The only change I made here is my action I changed to deploy. So now it's actually going to push the configuration to the appliance, all the same values. All right. So now I'll run that next part of code. And once again, nothing there. Nothing up my sleeve. Here comes the next round of code. Now I realize I don't have to keep doing this over and over, but I just kept the blocks there to be consistent for the demo. So there is our message success for the localhost F5 appliance for sample 1. Now I'll go into the F5, and now we'll see stuff in there. And the runtime is about 9 seconds. So I have all this hosted in Azure. I have my F5 appliance in Azure, a couple web servers in Azure. And just by that simple JSON blob, I now have a virtual server, all configured, ready to go. And there are some things I didn't actually specify that were configured. We'll get to that in a second. The AS3 did that for me, and I can show you what it did. So I didn't define any persistence. It defaulted to cookie. I gave it the web pool. Is my web pool, my one member on service port 80, and my HTTP monitor. All green. It's all working. And no iRules were defined, so still no iRules. There you go. Wasn't that cool? That was pretty easy. Even I can do this. So how did it configure all the other stuff we didn't define it? So this is one way to find out what the AS3 is actually going to configure based on the configuration you just passed in, the declaration you passed in. So here is the URL. And let me pause for a second. So all you do is add ? show full. that's going to show what the AS3 actually configured in its entirety. So I pass that into a variable, and I get that variable. I convert it to JSON, depth 4, so that it goes down into the other JSON elements, expands them all out, and I outed it to a file, basic, simple, full. You see that the file name, okay? All right. Okay. Sorry, it's a little slow. And here are all the items that the AS3 actually configured based on that simple declaration we passed in. So these are all some of the values that were just passed in by default. There's that declaration we passed in, and all we did is configure a virtual server, web pool, and one simple member. And this is everything that it actually did. So this is abstracting a lot of those things that if you don't have knowledge of, you don't need to have knowledge of. You have the F5 guy help you. If they want to configure these particular things individually, you can define them in that declaration. Otherwise, if you don't care, you take the defaults and you're ready to go. Okay. Doing good. I'm glad you asked. What happens if you want to update it or make a change? So now what I'm going to do is change that member that I have in that declaration. So I'll go back here. So now I'm going to do change member. Look at that. Look at that. I was thinking this stuff before I did this. So here's the same configuration. All I did was change the member in the pool. That's it. So now I'll go back, rerun my invoke REST method based on the new declaration. So I have the file name is changed, running all the same code again. I push it in. Success. So success, once again, for tenant sample 01 and to localhost. And to prove that it worked, go back into the F5, go down to the web pool, see nothing else was changed. And in the web pool, you'll see now the new member, 1.7. So, correct. Whatever is not in the declaration, 1.6 was in the previous one. It's now no longer in the new one. It's deleted, and now 1.7 is now added. Something to be mindful of. And still, yes?
So where you queried and got the full JSON on that previous step,
Yes.
can you do that to the existing common partition?
Unfortunately, you cannot target the common.
You can't do anything with common.
Can't do anything with common.
It'd be nice when you at least get the config out and maybe convert all of this to JSON for later.
I believe you can do gets from the common, possibly. That's something I haven't really tried myself personally, but I believe that it's possible to actually, with REST API or whatever, you can pull that out in the JSON, and you can then extrapolate that and push it into one of these configurations. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a couple changes now. I'm kind of getting a little ahead of myself. So I'm going to add 2 nodes into the pool. The original node I had, the new one I just added. But now, what if they're shared servers? Here's a little thing based on your question, and can you target the common partition? So you cannot target the common partition, but with the newer version of the AS3, at least 3.8, you can actually specify shared nodes. And if you hit that switch, this is also based on some feedback I gave them. If you hit that switch, it'll create those nodes in the common partition. Huh? That doesn't make any sense. No. So you can't target the common partition, but there are some classes that allow you to create objects in the common partition, but you cannot target it. So let me show you the example. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the manifest. Looks like I push it in first. Okay, success, yep, okay. Skip ahead here. All right, here is the difference. Go back a little bit. So all I changed in that configuration before was I added both members to the server address array, and I added this other switch for shared nodes. Set that to true. It now created those two nodes in the common partition, which can now be available to the other tenants. So this is a problem that I had earlier, which was a nightmare to resolve until they released this, which made things a lot easier. So now I'll go back, same partition. I'll go back to the pools, and what you're going to see now, next to the pool members at the end, the partition now says common on them. So these members are now available for other tenants, other partitions to use. So I'm sure a lot of guys out there have, and girls, have API servers that might be on shared boxes or whatever. There may be different applications. You can now configure AS3 to have both of those things there. Now I have some other examples where I add some HTTPS monitors to the pools. Does anyone want to see that? Or I can get to more meat and potatoes. Yeah, okay. So I changed the monitor for the members in the pool to HTTPS instead. So all I did is I got rid of HTTP, changed it to HTTPS, push it back in. Still good on time? Success, okay. Go check the F5 again. And now we will see our pools are still updating, and there we go. So I have no HTTPS currently configured for this configuration, so therefore there's no cert. It's broken. Now what I'll do next, yep, question?
Is there anything that prevents somebody from just putting in any VIP IP they want? Or is it?
Okay,
Because
so
you're an admin, you can put any IP.
the question is there anything that prevents anyone from putting any VIP IP in for a server address? Answer is unfortunately no. So if you pass something in and it has a conflict with something else, it actually won't push the configuration. It'll error out and say, oh, this address is already being used by this tenant for this virtual server. So now I'm going to put both monitors back, HTTP, HTTPS, push them in. Yep, question?
Yeah, so you said that we can't use the GUI anymore. Does it prevent us from using the GUI, or can we do it and then next time we push something, it'll just overwrite it?
So the question was, did I specify if you use ACE3, you can't use the GUI anymore? Let me be a little more clear on that. You can still use the GUI. Any changes you make in the GUI in a partition that was configured by the AS3, those changes will not be saved the next AS3 configuration that's passed in. Yep, they'll just be overwritten. So if you keep it in, if you add those changes to a declaration, it will then stay in. Question in the back?
Yeah, do you know, is the update a true update or a replace? Like, could you safely run an update every 5 minutes, and if you didn't change anything, you would just leave it alone?
If you don't change anything, the message that you get back, when it says status success, it'll say no change. So you can run it. You can almost kind of quasi DSC type configuration, yes. If you don't make any changes, it'll see no changes are made. It'll output no change.
Sorry, I have one other. You kind of mentioned on that had to be an admin. So is
Yep.
there any way to support like multi-tenant with this? So like, could you have multiple partitions and only allow access to one of them, or do you need access to everything?
The question was, I mentioned that the account has to have admin role. If you have multiple partitions, can you set it just to that partition? I believe it has to be to the appliance. I tried fooling around with this. It has to be to the appliance because the appliance has to do all the work. So back to this. So I'll add both monitors back in. So what will happen is HTTPS will stay broken. HTTP will then come back green again. Goes in. Okay. And I refresh the page. And you see now both monitors back up. And HTTP back green again. and both are green. Both have it. The next example is, all right, now I also said if I change the template to generic, I can then name my virtual server. So once again, the config all the same, and I change my template to generic, which now allows me to change my virtual server name from service main to something I actually want, or want it to be easy to identify with. Same all the same stuff. Push it back in. And success. Go back to F5. And here is my new virtual server, new name.
You basically found a way to rename a virtual server.
Yeah, it was bothering me. Like, oh, I don't want service main. If you wanted to name a virtual server something like for an application that you can identify, you have to create an additional one, and the service main will still be out there, like dead. Like, I don't want, a guy I work with will call them turds. I don't want turds in my F5 floating around. I want those things flushed out of there. So I changed my thing to generic. So here's an iRule example. And a lot of you work with iRules. Now, okay, so one thing I also mentioned was you can reference things in the common partition. So in this example, for the profile TCP, I put the syntax there. This is how you target something in the common partition you can pull in to your tenant. So almost any of these objects you can actually pull in. And the other thing I also did, oops, is I have my play iRule at the bottom. So I did change the app. I changed my virtual server name, and I'm specifying this new profile TCP. I'm targeting the common partition. I now define an iRule as part of my virtual server. So iRules, array, app iRule. Taking too long. And the syntax with JSON gets a little tricky. So how this iRule is formatted, this is a basic iRule based on a host header. We'll direct it to a particular pool as the traffic comes in. But this is the syntax you use that will actually make it pretty in the GUI. So you put some new line strokes in there. Looks kind of messy in here, but in the appliance, it's going to look like actual coded values. I'll pass that in. One small confession. This is the actual second time I've recorded this demo. And it may have happened in less than 24 hours. Reason why that is after recording it, I realized I don't think I made it big enough for people to see. So now you can see that that profile was actually targeted, oops, in the common partition. Did I go too far? I did. Sorry about that. Okay. And you see the reference common TCP. Now we'll get over to the iRule. And we see a new iRule, app iRule. And there's the formatted code with the line breaks and JSON syntax. Not too bad. Pretty neat. If your iRules get beastly, that doesn't get pretty in the manifest file. It is what it is. So here's an example with the cert. Here's the big one, certs. Dealing with certs isn't so easy. So this is an example I pulled right from F5. So F5's documentation, they have many, many, many examples of these declarations. So you can pull them in, fool around, like in a sandbox environment if you have. One quick note before we get to me defining the, one other thing. So you see web TLS class TLS server, that is actually reversed from what the GUI means. So usually you do define TLS client from coming in and TLS server going back. AS3 is TLS server coming in, TLS client going back. If you study relativity like I have in physics, that makes more sense with the actual frame of reference. But this is what a cert looks like in the configuration. Yeah, this is base 64. So I got the public key, private key pair. And I'll scroll, I want you to see this again. Ugh, that's gross. Yeah, and getting that in there was not fun. So I used their example because it's done. I'm not doing this again. So there is a way around that. That's part of my pipeline, and that was sort of a bear to solve. But I solved it outside of the manifest instead of inside of the manifest. Be a lot easier. Okay, so now I passed in a configuration that's using a cert. Now, the cert I'm using is from F5. Now, here's a cool thing that happened. I defined an HTTPS virtual server. And usually what you do is, oh, I got to create another virtual server for port 80 and redirect it to HTTPS. AS3 did that for you already. I defined HTTPS, and AS3 said, oh, all right, you also need this. It created the virtual server for port 80. I'll drill into that, and it created a rule for the redirect. Hey. Go to the resources, and there's the rule that it had attached. And this, the AS3 created all this for us. That's pretty cool. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, wow. Woo. And of course, I'll go through the pools. It's got these members in there. Well, it's the same members that I have. HTTPS is broken because the cert that F5 had provided is not on the devices. And there's the cert that F5 gave. It puts it in the cert store of the appliance. And if you need to update the cert, you update the base 64 key, and it replaces it. Okay. We're getting there. Now, if I want to add an additional app, so what does pushing two apps look like? So here is another configuration where I completely change the tenant name to sample2, another application A2. I stay with HTTP template. It doesn't matter. It's just creating another app. I left these random numbers in so I don't have any collisions with the other tenant that I'm using, the other IPs that I have. And I have some specified JSession ID with persistence cookie. This example also came from the F5 examples. So let me push forward a little bit here. Push this in. Now you see success message for tenant sample 2. So we now have a successful push. Now we have sample 01 still there. Now we see another tenant sample 2. Now we have two different apps configured on our F5 appliance. They're always different partitions. And I also asked the vendor, how many partitions can you have in an appliance? They said, depends. It's based on the app, on the resources of your appliance. So I don't know if that's 5 or 5,000. We don't have that many, so we haven't hit the limit yet. And okay, so I have this other template. Now this is, so what I've actually done to help try and solve this problem with the certs specifically is templatizing our manifest, our declaration manifest. So I have this syntax, hashtag curly brace, is an Octopus variable replacement syntax from Octopus Deploy. Now, I don't want to make it a focus on the tools I'm using, but more of it is possible to put this in a pipeline to have this deployed automatically for you. So I've tokenized a bunch of these values because really the F5 team doesn't care what the names are, what the IPs are. They just know what it is that has to be. So I pass in app VIP. As part of our pipeline, we can actually create a VIP. We define application names. We define environment types, what the project is. We go get the member IPs that are created if they're spun up all via pipeline. We pass all these variables, create all these variables, pass them all into this config, and then once you pass it into F5, everything is configured, and it takes roughly 9 to 10 seconds to do it. Just on the F5 piece. And I get to the cert. So is usually we call the cert like application cert, whatever. And we give it the URL it is. And here's the, now that's much prettier for a certain private key. Passing it into variables. Getting the variables is a little tricky, but at least the manifest is far easier to deal with. And there's also an iRule that I threw in there also as part of it.
Quick question.
Yes.
Can't you send PFX and challenge?
Okay, yes. So there's a recent update to AS3 that allow better support for PKCS12 PFX blobs. At first, I had zero luck with it. It just didn't work. I called them and said, guys, this does not work. They went and looked at it, and sure enough, an update comes out. Oh, wait a minute. I swear, when I ran this, when I recorded it, it worked. What happened? Demo gods? That's just a joke, guys. Ha ha, just see if you're paying attention. I'm sorry, that was not a good one. Okay, how we doing on time? All right, we're good, good. So another thing to talk about is how do we then remove stuff safely? So here is an example of how you target a particular partition, sample 01. I want to delete just sample 01. So I have the same URI call basically as before for my invoke rest method, but I changed my method to delete. And you really have to be careful what URL you use to delete. You'll see in a little bit. So I had two apps, sample 01, sample 02. I just want to remove one of them. So I target specifically in the URL. After declare the tenant I want to delete, I pass in the delete. I kick that off. Success, it was removed. Sample 01 was deleted. It doesn't really tell you the action, but I go back into F5 and you see sample 01 partition is now gone. Only sample 2 is left. So in order to do my pipeline demo, I need to do further cleanup. I want to get everything out of there because I'm creating a bunch of stuff. So the nuke command is if you pass in the original URL of the AS3 endpoint and you pass delete to that, it will delete everything you've declared. Don't do this. This is for professional use only. So I'm just going to run that before I run the pipeline through. And I'll take some time to explain the pipeline steps. So deleted success, we're ready to do. And you see deleted sample 2. It would have said everything if everything was there. So now I verified everything's gone. Everything is now gone. No, production's down. Okay. Okay, now big boy time. So let's get into the pipeline here. So here is Azure DevOps, and what I have here is my two builds, PR build where I run some pester tests, and my CI build. So I'll drill into my PR build quick, last one I did, and I have, all I do is basically execute some pester tests, and what they look like. Let me show you. So it runs them, I got a bunch of checks, they all pass. So let me quickly show you what those pester tests look like. So I have two tests that run. The first test is I validate AS3 config, I validate required schema parents. So I want to make sure that the AS3 class is there. I want to make sure that I'm persisting true. I want the config actually to stick. I'm also looking for that there is a declaration. There should be a declaration field there. And I want to look for action deploy. I want to make sure I'm deploying to the F5. The other set of tests here, I'm looking for particular child items. So I want to make sure that the ADC declaration is ADC, capitalized. And I'm making sure my version matches the version in the schema. So I'm actually making sure that any manifest I have is using the same version I'm using for the AS3. And I should return any ID declarations. They should not be empty. So I should have an ID for every declaration I'm passing in. And the last check is I'm making sure that my template is generic so I can name my service mains and not leave any turds out there for me to flush later. And the other test I use is a JSON validator. So just make sure that JSON syntax is valid. So I'll grab the file, try to convert it from JSON. If it fails, not valid. fails, test fails. That's simple. So I did that for the purpose of demonstration, so to give you an idea that I do some checks, blah, blah, blah. Bob's your uncle. So there's the test, they run. Then I have a CI build. In my CI build, all that has is I package up my manifests with JSON files. I push package over to Octopus, and then I create the release. And from there, Octopus picks it up and deploys, all going through. And since I have some quality gates as part of this, I'm happy that it can just deploy automatically. So here is some, I think I'm actually going to be running out of time. I apologize. But here are the steps in Octopus that I use, and most of the magic is in the create cert variables. There's a ton of code in there to extrapolate. So Octopus, I can store the cert in Octopus, grab the values from Octopus, extrapolate public key from the private key, store them in separate variables, pass them into the config. That's basically how it works. So a quick demo of how it runs. So here's the code I was talking about that does all that mumbo jumbo with the certs. It took a little while to get this figured out. And then I create the certs, I pass them into Octopus for later use, deploy the manifest, and then send the config to F5. So as a quick run, and here is my send config. I have my system except system net service point manager except 100 false, so I don't get that error. And here's my creds. I pass in via Octopus variables, which are kept secret. JSON blob, declare, go. So I kick off a CI build, queue it, hop over to Octopus. Once the packages land there, release is created, Octopus automatically deploys. Deploying, goes right into the F5. Once it lands, once it's successful, which it will be, I now see my new app, HTTPS, with my cert that I passed in. My pool with all my variabilized names, my pool members. One member actually has a cert, the other one, I'm like, whatever. I have an iRule, demo app iRule defined. And that concludes all the demo. If you do have other questions, I'll be out here partying because I'm finally done. So quick, real summary. AS becomes the authority once you start using it, treat it as such. It can also be used with Big IQ and with Ansible. It can also run as a Docker container. So if you don't want to push the module into every single appliance, you can run the AS3 as a container, target the container, but the difference is it's making the REST calls to the appliance instead of it being native, so it's not as fast. Multi-tenancy provides less risk. Go out, rule the world. I'm finally done. Thank you.